targets for World War I ask us to define and understand the causes and consequences of World War I in regards to the social, political, and economic causes. I think it would be a really good idea for you to take notes as we go through this PowerPoint and basically set up a worksheet, maybe in your notebook or on Note, well, it'd be hard on Notability, but in your notebook that would include perhaps a chart. Something kind of like this, right? With the social and political and, of course, economic causes and consequences. Or you can set it up the other way. But this would be a good idea because not only is it going to help you stay focused as we go through this PowerPoint lecture, but also, of course, it will help you answer the learning target, which, as you guys know, the learning targets always end up on the exam. So let's continue. World War I happened from 1914 to 1918, and it is often considered the first modern type of warfare because it does involve modern technology. It's also unique in that it is truly a world war in which you will have colonial powers included in the fighting with European strongholds, and also don't forget the U.S. Most of you are not terribly familiar with the early part of World War I, as the United States does not get involved until 1917. So for really 2.5 years, Europe is well entrenched in a war that is very devastating and really hasn't been covered as extensively as World War II, but undoubtedly has almost as big of an impact. World War I has been named a few different things. The one thing, one of the nicknames is Family Feud because it really dealt with different feuds amongst different monarchies who happened to be, for the most part, interrelated. So you had cousins kind of fighting against cousins. The Fall of the Eagles refers to the family crest of the Habsburg family. That would be your Austria-Hungary. And then also Germany, if you remember, their flags have eagles on them. We know it also known as the War to End All Wars, which that's taught in U.S. history, and also, of course, the war to make the world safe for democracy, supposedly. Now let's turn our attention to the causes of World War I. Typically in U.S. history, you are taught that there are 4 main causes, which also conveniently works for the acronym MAIN. Sometimes I like to say it's MAIN because there's really 2 A's. The first one we're going to look at, the first A, is the alliance system. The alliance system was fully entrenched before the war actually broke out. On the left you have the Triple Entente, which includes Great Britain, France, and Russia. On the left, on the right rather, you have the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These systems were in place for quite some time. The biggest concern, obviously, is that when you have alliance systems like this, why do you have them? And ultimately, what is going to come of them? When war finally does break out, you have essentially 2 armed camps. The Triple Entente Alliance group has now become the Allied powers, which, as you guys know, the U.S. eventually joins. And on the right, you have what's now known as the Central Powers. The Allied powers at this point, when the war breaks out, have Italy joining their side, and their biggest issue is that Italy did not like what Austria-Hungary and Germany did to Serbia when the war broke out, so they switched sides. The Central Powers have now added Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, down here. We know it as Turkey nowadays, but back then it was known as the Ottoman Empire. Here you see the major players involved as far as leadership is concerned between 1914 and 1917. The reason this doesn't go into 1918 is that some of these leaders no longer exist in power by 1918. Also, a little curious thing you might notice is look at these 2 guys over here, Nicholas II and George V of Great Britain. They might look like identical people. They are not. They are actually uncle here, and nephew down here. They're, of course, George's mother, and then Nicholas's grandmother was Queen Victoria of England. So here kind of gets us back to not only the issue of the dueling monarchies, well, they are on the same side, but the issue of inbreeding, which we'd kind of talked about within the royal family back with Spain. Here you see a map of Europe in 1914 before the formal outbreak of war. This does show some of the armistice lines and some other things like that, but ultimately what we want you to get from this is the size of the Triple Entente and its allies, and then the Central Powers, and of course you see in pink the neutral powers, although some of those neutral powers become very close to being drawn into the war. So now let's look at the second cause of the war, and this one would be the M, of course, in our acronym, militarism and the arms race. And what you guys should notice, and initially this might not mean much, but look at the bottom chart here between 1910 and 1914, how much more money countries like Russia and astoundingly Germany were spending on their defense, which the big question is, why would you be spending so much of your government's money on military and defense spending if you weren't planning on getting involved in some type of conflict? Another cause of World War I would be the economic and imperial rivalries. So hopefully you're jotting down this for the economic causes. We know that imperialism had been growing about 40 to 50 years before the outbreak of war, and it suddenly becomes very important to certain countries that they get as much land as they can, but now most of the land is spoken for. So if I can't get any more land because there's none available, how do I get it? I should take it by force. So you start to have countries realize that if there was an outbreak of world war, and if they could beat a different power, then they could make that power give up their land to them, and thus the winning country would expand their empire. And of course, it would allow them to get more resources and have new markets to sell to. So it really would be a winning situation on two fronts if you were the victorious side of an outbreak of conflict. And now we look at the final main cause of World War I, and that would be nationalism. We talked about nationalism as our first, one of our first learning targets in this unit, and the idea that countries are starting to identify themselves as strong, independent nations. And we know that nationalism, for the most part, is kind of like extreme patriotism. But what happens at the outbreak of World War I, or up to it, is that countries literally believe that they are better than other countries in the world, and they want to prove that they are better. And what better way to do that than to beat somebody else militarily? So this is a pretty cool graphic. I've always been a big fan of it. It does show, of course, some stereotypical viewpoints of certain countries in the world, but it does show how these countries really do build up their military and become pretty aggressive when it comes to taking on other parts of Europe. And then finally, we talk about the powder keg of Europe, which, looking at this map, you might not kind of understand where this region is. It's known in 1914 as the Balkans, but we probably know it more so as Yugoslavia, which eventually becomes Yugoslavia. Of course, we have Greece down here, and then you eventually have this become Turkey, and these become kind of independent nations. This area was full of conflict because you have all these different ethnic groups trying to live peacefully together, and they all kind of want their own independent nations, and it's just not going to happen. So now we look at what we call the spark, if you will, of the war that really ignites this very dangerous powder keg that was really gearing up to explode for years to come. The picture here you see is of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his family, and he was set to overtake ruling power of Austria-Hungary from his uncle. There is a population of people in this area, the Serbs, that do not want to be part of the Austrian-Hungary Empire anymore, and there was some concern that if Franz Ferdinand came into power that he would not grant them independence. Although historians have realized, kind of looking at his readings or his writings and speeches that he's given, he probably would have recognized their independence. So it's ultimately very tragic what happens to him. Well, on a parade in Sarajevo, Franz Ferdinand will be assassinated, and his wife will be as well. While they were on a parade route, there was an attempted assassination, grenade attempt earlier in the parade, and the car was trying to get off the route, and it couldn't, and Princip was astonished. Princip, by the way, is this guy right here. He's the assassin. He was surprised that the motorcade went right in front of him, so he pulled out his gun, and he took his chance, I guess you could say, and was able to kill both of them. Princip was a member of a Serbian terrorist group known as the Black Hand, and they would claim that they acted alone, but ultimately that was not a good enough answer for most of Europe, particularly Germany, who was an ally of Austria-Hungary. So the big question becomes, who ultimately was to blame for this? Was the outbreak of war really simply this assassination, or was it really a combination of the four things we talked about: the militarism, the alliance system, imperialism, or was it this aggressive nationalism? And was truly the